Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to talk by way of introduction about sculpture, and especially figurative sculpture in a general sense, but then focus upon Antony Gormley, of course. His work generally over 40 years or more, and three installations in particular that resonate with me and perhaps with you too, because of their northeast locations, and in my case, because of some small degree of personal involvement that I had. As you know, sculpture has been used as a form of human expression since prehistoric times. The earliest known works of sculpture go back to around 30,000 BC. Ancient peoples created small animal and human figures carved in bone or ivory or stone, mainly for spiritual purposes. Traditions of carving and casting came out of the ancient civilizations of the Mediterranean. The cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia often created sculptures on a monumental scale, and these related to religious life or functioned as a memorial to the power of rulers, the pyramids, of course. In ancient Greece and Rome, the human form was the dominant subject in sculpture, and the artists of classical Greece achieved a very high degree of naturalism in sculpting the human form, and the human form was considered the most respected and revered subject matter for art. So the term figurative sculpture is generally associated with historical works created in traditional materials, such as marble or bronze, such as the Venus de Milo's, Michelangelo's David, or Rodin's The Thinker. But contemporary artists continue to explore its wide range of possibilities through a variety of new techniques and materials and interpretations. Nowadays, there seems to be no strict division between figurative and abstract sculpture. Many works we regard as figurative, especially those made in the 20th century, have abstract elements and vice versa. And certain aspects of Gormley's work prove this point. The American artist Adolf Reinhardt once said that sculpture is something that you bump into when you back up to look at a painting. And I guess you've been to enough art galleries to know what he meant. But because sculpture frequently occupies space in much the same way as humans occupy space, we can identify that with sculpture in a different way than with painting. Unlike painting, which traditionally represents an illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface, sculpture actually inhabits the space shared by the viewer. Sculpture is also tactile. You can actually touch it, feel its various textures and forms. And finally, looking at sculpture is a dynamic activity. The work changes as the viewer moves. Well, looking at modern and contemporary sculpture, in the latter half of the 19th century, in the early 20th, a movement called modernism departed from the neoclassical style, and sculptures paid more attention to stylization, form, and contrasting qualities of the surface of the material, resulting in more abstractly stylized sculpture, as in the work here of Henry Moore and Alberto Giacometti. And more recently, artists have blurred the boundaries between different art media by mixing sculptural materials and with sound and light and video projection and two-dimensional images to create three-dimensional environments. And this form of art, known as installation art, goes beyond the traditional viewing of sculpture. So where does Antony Gormley fit in? Well, maybe a bit of everything, but you judge. Sir Antony Gormley was born in London in 1950, the youngest of 7 children to a German mother and a father of Irish descent. And because his mum was German, you might have read more recently that he has applied for German citizenship, having been disillusioned with Brexit and life post-Brexit in this country. Gormley's paternal grandfather was an Irish Catholic from Derry, who settled in Walsall in Staffordshire. Gormley went to Ampleforth College, the Benedictine boarding school in Yorkshire, before reading archaeology, anthropology, and the history of art at Trinity College, Cambridge. Then he studied at St. Martin's School of Art and Goldsmiths in London, and then a postgraduate course in sculpture at the Slade School of Fine Art between 1977 and 79. While at Slade, he met Vicken Parsons, who was to become his assistant, and in 1980, his wife, as well as a successful artist in her own right. Now, as you know, a great deal of his work takes the human body as its subject, with his own body used in many works as the basis for metal castings. His wife, Vicken, has traditionally done most of the body molding. He described the body as the closest experience of matter that I will ever have, and the only part of the material world that I live inside. Gormley's public career began with a solo exhibition at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in 1981. Now, I couldn't possibly cover all his works here over more than 40 years of practice. His first few exhibitions were in London. Here's a photo from a 1983 exhibition at the Coracle Gallery in London. He very quickly built up an international reputation. His first exhibition outside the UK was in New York in 1984 at the Salvatore Ala Gallery. He was back at the same gallery in New York in the next year exhibiting his drawings. And the second drawing here immediately makes you think of what later became the Angel of the North. And shortly afterwards, another exhibition in the same gallery in New York. And here's a 1984 piece that I think also suggests the angel. The first piece of work that I'd particularly like to dwell on is this one, Sculpture for Derry Walls, 1987, a three-part sculpture in three particular locations on the Derry Walls, where his granddad came from, remember? On the east, overlooking the Foyle River, over the Bogside, and on the bastion, overlooking the Fountain Estate. And each sculpture consisted of two identical cast iron figures joined back to back. They hold a cruciform pose, and they're placed in such a way that one faces into the walled city and the other outside. In simple terms, it could be said that the sculptures represent Derry's two dominant religious communities, turning away from each other, but paradoxically joined as one body. They're separated by their religious, cultural, and political differences, but united in their Christianity and their shared location. Here is an exhibition in Denmark in 1989. And a major exhibition in Australia in the same year. Actually, an exhibition of two works, a field for the Art Gallery in New South Wales and a room for the Great Australian Desert. And they were created when Gormley was artist in residence at the Art Gallery in New South Wales in Sydney in October of 1989. Gormley explored a flat plain of red dust and clay pans in the very arid centre of Australia. It became his chosen site for the concrete construction that he called a room, top right here, but it was also where he decided to use the red clay of the area to first create the terracotta figures that he became later associated with. He made 1,100 of them, each about 9 inches high, from the red clay of the center, and he arranged them in the gallery in two hemispheres around a central path across the gallery space diagonally. The figures are spaced most densely near the center of the room, and they radiate out like the line forces of a magnetic field. And that's why where the term field that is used so much in his work came from. When a viewer stands at the center of the space, they find themselves at the epicenter of a kind of field of energy. Although the field seems to radiate out from the center, the eyes of the figures are all raised towards the viewer's face. This is Havman, 1994, a work that's made from Arctic granite. that looks out towards the horizon at the end of a Norwegian fjord just below the Arctic Circle. And again, the word horizon is used a great deal by Gormley in his installations. This installation, Critical Mass, 1995, comprises 5 body casts of 12 positions: standing, hanging, ground hugging, crouching, fetal, squatting, sitting, kneeling, and so on, and then laid out in different orientations. Gormley describes it as an anti-monument, evoking the victims of the 20th century, and when assembled close together like this, appear tumbled as if they'd been dumped from the back of a truck. These figures have been exhibited many times, here in Rio in 2012. So Gormley had moved on from displaying single figures in the landscape, like Havman, to multiple figures, and the generic series called Another Place was begun, first in Cuxhaven in Germany, and then back to Norway and Stavanger, and many other locations on a temporary basis. And this included Crosby Beach in Merseyside, which has become a permanent location and one of his best-known installations. Here it is. Another familiar installation, because it was displayed on another floor of the Baltic at the time of the 2003 Domain Field exhibition, is called Allotment. And here's the first one in Denmark in 1992. 1997, I beg your pardon. And then here in Malmö, Sweden, where the gallery director was Sune Nordgren, who later became Baltic's first director and hence was keen to show this installation in Gateshead. We'll cover the Angel of the North in a moment, but don't think these ideas were only played out through installations or exhibitions in the Northeast. Here's an angel in Cologne, 1998. And here's something that looks remarkably like the sculptures created for Domain Field at Baltic 2 years earlier, here in Tokyo. And 2 more pre-Baltic installations here, Naples, Salzburg. Some other images that I'll just run through very quickly. Here's one in Brussels. I like the dog on the left-hand side. Back in Australia, figures in the landscape, rather emaciated figures. This exhibition, this installation inside Australia, 51 carbonized abstracted steel life-size figures positioned about 750 meters apart, created in 2003 over a 16 square kilometer area on Lake Ballard, Western Australia, where it's now permanently installed. And as you walk across the sand between each of these, your footsteps create a kind of field. Here's an exhibition at Tate Britain of Gormley's own body shape on a bed of toast. It was his first work to present the precise trace of his body as its subject, and consists of more than 8,000 slices of white bread, out of which we're told Gormley ate the equivalent of his own volume. Not sure about that. Here, a different kind of exhibition in this slide and the next, based around creating shapes for the public to interact with their bodies. More figures in the landscape here, this time in Italy. Here, a Baltic-type figure inside its own kind of magnetic field, Brussels, 2006. This is the Waste Man, the same year, made over a 6-week period at the end of the summer of 2006, out of around 30 tons of waste materials that had been gathered by the Thanet Waste Disposal Services and by local people and deposited in an area of Margate known as Dreamland. Some works are made in wax to be cast in bronze, but this was made of domestic waste to be cast in fire, made from raw materials of people's homes, their lives, beds, tables, dining chairs, toilet seats, desks, pianos, and rubbish, all transformed into energy. The piece burned in 32 minutes, sending showers of sparks over the large crowd of spectators who had gathered. In 2009, Gormley presented One Another. This was a fourth plinth commission, an invitation for members of the public chosen by lot to spend 1 hour on the vacant plinth in Trafalgar Square in London. You might remember this idea. Behind One Another was the thought that the plinth would be occupied for 100 consecutive days, 24 hours a day, by members of the public who would volunteer to stand on it for an hour at a time. So 2,400 people would be able to participate. And this living art happening initially attracted a lot of media attention. It even became a topic of discussion on the BBC radio drama series The Archers, and Gormley made an appearance as himself. More figures set in the built landscape or out on the horizon: the Alps, New York, London, and Hong Kong. This event horizon, this idea in Hong Kong, comprised 31 life-sized and anatomically correct castings of his body, 4 in cast iron and 25 in fiberglass. And they were also installed on top of prominent buildings along London's South Bank and installed in locations around New York City's Madison Square in 2010. This is an exhibition from 2010 also, and this is called Exposure, and this is a large crouching human form, Netherlands. And here, an installation called Still Standing. This marked the first time that a living artist had engaged with the Hermitage's classical galleries. Just to speak for a moment about this one, it was called Drift 1 at an art gallery in Basel, in Switzerland. It's a lightweight structure that exists on the cusp between a drawing and a thing. It was conceived as a 3-dimensional drawing in space, derived through some kind of generative evolution, but it had an adequate mass, enough to be called an object, but expressed enough of a field function to be thought of as a place. But this one was not to the exclusion of more solid structures, and in the next year, this newer work, Expansion Field, consisting of 60 individual sculptures fabricated from corten steel, derived mainly from different postures of the human body in Switzerland. And here in 2014, a crouching figure, a familiar pose now perhaps, but actually created as part of the facade of the Beaumont Hotel in Mayfair. And there's a room inside. You can pay to have that room. You can be inside Gormley's sculpture for the night. Here in the Northeast, in 2015, Space Stations, an exhibition at the Hatton Gallery. And this group of drawings of Gormley from 2002 to 2014 reveal how drawing and sculpture have been in continuous dialogue and development throughout the artist's career. He's even been in the National Portrait Gallery, suspended on the staircase. I wonder what people thought as they moved upstairs. Some more recent exhibitions. This is Shanghai 2017, also suspended figures, similar to the one in the portrait gallery. Hong Kong, the White Cube, 2018. And Philadelphia, just 1 or 2 years ago, 2019. And this one is in Singapore. This is a major exhibition. I'll come back to this briefly at the end. Here, a very interesting project from 2019, and one that kind of linked sculpture down the centuries, the old and the new, called Site. It was a site-specific exhibition in collaboration with the Museum of Antiquities on the Greek archaeological island of Delos. And it marks the first time that an artist has taken over the site since this mythological island was inhabited over 5,000 years ago. In the installation, Gormley repopulated the island with body forms, 29 sculptures made during the last 20 years, including 5 specifically made new works, both at the periphery of the island and integrated amongst Delos's archaeological sites. And his sculptures, taking naturalistic, cubic, and more abstracted forms, either stand or lie on the ground, exposed to the elements. Interacting with the island's topography, the works appear and disappear. They activate the elemental character of the island and its human history. Now I'd like to talk about the field, this particular field that became Field for the British Isles. These are the little terracotta figures. I mentioned that it started in Australia. Then in 1991, American Field was made with the help of the Texca family, brickmakers in the parish of San Matias in Cholula in Mexico. It was first exhibited at the Salvatore Ala Gallery, the one mentioned earlier, in New York, and it later toured other venues in the US, Mexico, and Canada. And 2 years later, European Field was commissioned by Malmö Konsthall, Sweden, for a major solo exhibition by Gormley, again created by local people. European Field subsequently toured venues all over Europe for 3 years. And an Asian Field has been installed in Hong Kong. But here is Field for the British Isles at the Greenfield Briar Works, Engineering Works in Gateshead, 1996, an installation of called Field for the British Isles. It was part of the huge program to mark the Year of Visual Art in the Northeast. And this installation marked the first time the work had been shown in a non-gallery space. It was also its first viewing as part of the Arts Council collection, who had purchased Field for the British Isles in 1995. It's the largest single artwork in the Arts Council collection. And it was back in the region last year on display in the Northern Gallery for Contemporary Art at the National Glass Centre in Sunderland. And this rather monumental installation comprises 40,000 small clay figures, first made by Gormley in '93 from a mountain of brick clay with over 100 volunteers. And they were invited to find their own form for each figure, following 3 simple instructions: hand-sized, stand up, and have eyes. And Field has been exhibited at a variety of venues across the UK. At each location, the configuration of Field is changed to suit the space, but the thousands of small figures are always installed to resemble a dense carpet, with each figure looking directly at the viewer. And there have been so many interpretations of the work and so many different responses. Does it represent mankind as a whole? Overpopulation? The crowd at a political rally or some other gathering? The silent majority? People who are powerless? No mouth, no voice? Are they Holocaust victims? Are they zombies? Are they robots that looks that are accusing or forlorn? Here's another installation of this particular work. So now moving to the Angel of the North, completed in 1998. As you know, a steel sculpture located in Gateshead, overlooking the A1 motorway, commissioned by Gateshead Council and majority funded by the National Lottery. The Angel of the North is as much a feat of engineering as a work of art. When I used to work at Arts and Business, I used to speak to the business community about the Angel as a project that was as much about materials, design, construction, as it was about art itself. It has a wingspan of 54 meters, greater than a Boeing 757, and it's able to withstand winds of over 100 miles an hour in this exposed hilltop location, which is the mound created after the closure of the Lower Tyne Colliery out of the destroyed remains of the Pithead Baths. And Gormley says that it's a kind of tumulus marking the end of the era of coal mining in Britain. The structural engineers who worked with Gormley were O'Vara, and they had worked with him on previous sculptures. And again, the sculpture is a scaled up version of Gormley's body, stands 20 meters tall. Typically, a human figure leans to adjust to the loading imposed by a gust of wind, but the statue had to withstand these forces in a static state. And as a result, the connections joining the wings to the body, strength of the ankles and the foundations are all vital points in the design. Originally, it was assumed that it would be necessary to make the ankles thicker, as a top-heavy sculpture would be in danger of falling over. Instead, the fabricator specified strengthened steel ribs to transmit the wind loads through to the foundations, enabling the slim ankle shape. The wings. And beneath the ground, 700 tons of concrete and 32 tons of reinforcing steel were used in the foundations, and these extend down 20 meters, anchoring to the solid rock below. Well, sculptures are often cast in bronze, but something stronger was needed, so steel was specified. The cost of repeatedly painting conventional steelwork or using stainless steel was too high, so it had been suggested Corten steel. Corten is a special alloy that combines steel and copper that forms a rusty patina during the first few years of exposure. And this low maintenance and visually interesting finish protects the structure from environmental corrosion. So the body, weighing 100 tons, and the two wings, each weighing 50 tons, were built separately and transported to the site for assembly. And seen by more than one person every second, 90,000 every day, or 33 million every year, the Angel of the North is one of the most viewed pieces of art in the world. The wings themselves are angled at 3.5 degrees forward, which Gormley says was to create a sense of embrace. And here you recognize its spectacular location. And here you remember how a beloved piece of art such as this gets linked to a beloved figure in the field of football, although Gormley wasn't too pleased when, just ahead of one of our forlorn appearances in a cup final, the Shearer shirt was put on the Angel and rather quickly removed. I think you'll know that a maquette is a scale model used to visualize and test forms and ideas without incurring the expense and effort of producing a full-scale piece, and that Gormley produced a small number of pre-production maquettes. One sold for an amazing 2.8 million at auction at Sotheby's, and you'll probably remember one was created for Gateshead Council and used for fundraising, and it was valued at £1 million on the Antique Roadshow. Well, here's McHenry, former leader of Gateshead Council, with a number of images of the Angel that have been sold, in shop in the shop at Baltic, and otherwise created. So the third local connection I'd like to mention is the 2003 Domain Field exhibition at Baltic, which I've already referred to. You've seen some of the drawings that these sculptures were based on, and some of the work that used the same technique, like the huge Gormley sculpture that was in London, located next to the O2. Here it is, called Quantum Cloud, commissioned for the site as a Millennium Project and completed in 1999. At 30 meters, it's taller than the angel, and it's constructed from a collection of tetrahedral units made from 1.5 meter long sections of steel. And the steel sections were arranged using a computer model with a random walk algorithm starting from points on the surface of an enlarged figure based on Gormley's body that forms, as you can see, a residual outline at the center of the sculpture. Well, with Domain Field in Gateshead at Baltic, there are several differences to the angel. First, the end product was not based on Gormley's own body cast, a single body, but on the bodies of the many participants in the project. And whereas the angel was dense and solid, the Domain Field sculptures were light, fragile, weightless, ethereal, translucent, with some sense of energy and gentle movement, like metal skeletons, maybe even ghostly, like the imprint of a body that had been left behind, floating, fading into a mist, defying gravity in some way. And it was a maze of individual sculptures, all of different sizes and shapes, 285 of them molded in plaster and made from volunteer models aged 2 to 85. These molds were then used to construct the individual sculptures by a process of welding the steel bars together inside each mold, in the molds, but by doing it in a matrix of irregular angles rather than forcing them into the shape of the shell. And here are the shells, and here's one of the welders. One of the welders who was actually responsible for inserting these metal bars into the plaster cast body shells said he felt like a surgeon, like stepping inside a body. Well, I ended up as a volunteer, almost as a dare. I was a trustee of the former Northern Rock Charitable Foundation that was a funder of Baltic and a funder of this particular project. And the trustees were given the option of taking part. So fellow trustee, Chris Job, and I challenged each other to do it. Here I am at the start of the process. I'm sculpture number 77. The experience was interesting, to say the least. It was covered in Vaseline, and then in cling film, then in Hessian, and then in plaster. And it was really quite disorientating. There's a high degree of sensory deprivation caused by the silence, temperature change during the process. Had to split really the plastering into two sections. Originally, the idea was just to have a single section, a single body cast, but this was really difficult for some people to manage. So it eventually became 2 bits of plaster, 2 upper body and lower body, which were then put together. And here we are, standing next to our bodies at the end of the process. This is me specifically alongside my own body shape, a bit slimmer than I am. And here with Chris. And the molds, plaster molds, in the end weren't wanted. They were left outside the gallery, the back of the gallery. And there was a phone call to my house where somebody said that they're here if you want them, otherwise they'll be thrown out. I wasn't particularly interested, but my wife decided it was a good idea, so she went with her car, picked it up, brought it home, and it's ended up in the garden shed. Too perishable to be outside like a scarecrow, but it's there. If somebody climbs over the garden wall and takes a look, they might get a view of it. They might just scare them off if their purposes are nefarious. And for some extraordinary reason, my picture was used in one of the leaflets and posters that Baltic created for general publicity purposes. And Domain Field did go elsewhere. Here, the Great Hall in Winchester in 2004. I did ask Gormley's team at one point if I were to try to buy my own sculpture, what would it cost? And the answer came back £100,000. So I didn't do it. It's not much. So look, I'd like to just to finish by looking at some of the more recent work and current work. This is Singapore. I mentioned it earlier, on display really for quite a long period of time because there's a lot in it, and it includes the new large-scale installation Horizon Field in Singapore. And in this commission, you know, you see bottom right, the visitors can step into a matrix of intersecting metal and take part in a rather odd spatial experience that kind of continually shifts as you walk through it. And the work expands Gormley's approach to sculpture as a kind of collaborative, ongoing dialogue between the artist, the object, and the audience. Current sculpture 2002, an installation. There's several pieces here, but this is within the Louvre in Paris in the floor wing. And if you take The Guardian, then maybe a few months ago, the early part of 2022, you might have spotted an article in the Saturday Supplement Culture section with the headline, "Antony Gormley unveils his grandest design yet." Well, that's for others to decide, but this one is called Frame, and it's a maze of wires with a small cutout of a human placed inside to give a sense of scale, which is very large. And the other new piece as part of this is called Stem, which Gormley called Rodin's Thinker on the Toilet, with its head dropped onto folded arms, constructed as a series of cubist blocks of cast iron and high tensile steel. Well, thank you very much for following this. If you want to look more, you can read about and see a lot about Gormley's projects and drawings and installations and exhibitions on his own website, antonygormley.com. But in the meantime, I want to thank you again for being part of this presentation.